think we're ready to party. So this will be our fourth session, I believe, with the natural order. We have Paul here with myself today, and today's topic is going to be environmentalism, something Paul has a good bit of experience with. So I'm going to be taking a kind of a back seat, side seat, and because yeah, my perspective is pretty fresh on it. I'll give a little bit of context. I mean, when I was younger, a little bit more naive. When it came to all things environment, I definitely saw some of the typical narratives about like, oh, we're destroying the earth and all the, look at all the pollution that we're doing and everything from the ozone to global warming and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, I see the videos of pollution and all this kind of stuff, but I never like looked into it too much. And then fast forward a little bit, I start to see, become more right wing. I kind of see the problems on the left. I see how they're like, while there are some valid concerns, they're like trying to weaponize this kind of stuff and they're skewing it and warping it. And there's just so many weird narratives around like electric cars and emissions and how it's not as efficient. And there's just so many problems. And ever since, I've kind of not really dug into it. So this is gonna be a great opportunity for me to learn and to kind of go from there. So I'll let you take it away.
Sure. So I do consider myself an environmentalist, and there are definitely some real problems that humanity is causing for the environment. But unfortunately, a lot of our conversation about the environment around the major issues that are an issue today, a lot of that has kind of been distorted and weaponized by people who don't actually care about the environment but care about control.
Yep.
So I guess the first thing we're going to look at here. So most people today have been convinced that the biggest problem facing our environment is global climate change, supposedly caused by carbon emissions, which have skyrocketed in the past few decades because of human activity. And we're told that there's like a 97% consensus of, climate scientists agreeing on two basic facts uh, that carbon emissions are the primary driver of climate change today, and that the problem that they're causing is basically bordering on catastrophic. And that is almost entirely false. So if you want to go ahead and pull up that first link, that Forbes article, um, that 97% number that's been thrown around, I think Colbert did kind of a skit based on it where he brought on like three climate scientists who disagree with the consensus and then brought out 97 climate scientists who agree with it. It's kind of a ridiculous piece of propaganda that was clearly just propaganda and not meant to settle any kind of a debate. Um, but when you look into where that figure comes from, the study that's cited as showing that 97% of climate scientists agree did not actually prove that at all conclusively. So, first of all, in order to get to that number, they basically looked at a bunch of published papers and like scientific peer-reviewed articles and journals, um, tallied up, the percent of them that basically disagreed with the man-made climate change narrative and those that agreed with them. But in order to, you know, classify them, basically any article that did not explicitly disagree with the man-made climate change hypothesis got lumped into the agree column. So there were a bunch of papers that had no real say one way or another on whether or not carbon emissions were the biggest problem, on whether or not man-made global climate change was real, on whether or not it was, going to be catastrophic, that got lumped into agreeing with the mainstream narrative that man-made climate change from carbon emissions is the biggest environmental problem and that it's disastrous, even though they didn't say anything like that. And there are plenty of scientists whose papers got lumped into that agree column that have come forward since then and said, none of my papers said anything like this. I don't agree with this position. You're totally misrepresenting my data. So there are a lot of those scientists who have come forward and said they're being misrepresented, and so I think that we really need to set the record straight on that. That
Right.
you know, yeah, that we're being lied to about this.
So
There is nowhere near as strong of a consensus as we're being told.
I wanted to jump in there for a second and say that yeah, like, and we've seen plenty of examples of how they like warp the science and do all kinds of like statistical manipulations, whether it's the studies themselves or how they're reported on. So we saw that with COVID, of course, among other things.
Hmm.
So one thing I wanted to come back to is you're saying so you're obviously the mainstream narrative is saying like carbon emissions are like the greatest contributor to uh, did you say to pollution or to warming? I don't know if you said did you say to warming? in particular?
To warming in particular, climate change overall, basically, and
Okay.
that climate change is the biggest problem, and all of that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's, and this may be where you're taking it, so I don't want to derail us or anything, but what I'm thinking in my mind is like, you know, to rewind a little bit, is so we are kind of saying, okay, well, the warming is happening. Is that something that are we agreeing with that, or do we need to break that? Are we breaking that down?
I'll actually be breaking that down in a minute. So some warming has happened, but there was actually like a roughly 15-year pause in warming from the late 90s till the early teens. And some of the people who are on the pro carbon emission narrative, or the narrative that that's what's causing our problems, I guess I should say. Some of the people who are on that narrative have tried to come up with excuses for why warming basically stopped for 15 years and how carbon emissions are somehow still causing the problem. But there's a lot of things that really don't fit with their narrative that we're seeing, and yet we're still having this narrative shoved in our faces 24/7.
Okay. Okay, got you. So, one other question, and again, I assume we're going to go into this. So, this is just to help me frame it, and maybe to help anybody else that's watching it frame it. Which is that the next question. So we're warming. We're saying yes, we're seeing some things there, but it's not. Of course, we got to break it down and explain it. Is that the kind of the core focus of what the environmental problem is, or is there are there other kind of are we going to talk about? I assume we're going to talk about other ramifications of pollution, as well.
Yeah, a little bit later, once we've kind of debunked the carbon emission and climate change threat as being the biggest threat, we're going to get into some actual much bigger threats like wildlife loss, habitat destruction, deforestation, giant islands of trash in our oceans,
Excellent.
soil erosion, water, groundwater contamination. There are a ton of different environmental
Yeah.
problems, and some of them are much more real. Some of them are much more serious
Yes.
than anything that carbon emissions are causing, and yet we're given this narrative, and I think we're given it for a political reason
Right.
because, as we'll get to later, when you break down the causes of some of those problems, you know, carbon emissions is the one thing that can be solidly blamed on people from the West and from more developed countries like China. Whereas a lot of the like deforestation, that's happening mostly in Africa and Latin America. Species extinction, that's happening mostly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We're poaching, that's happening mostly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The West does a very good job of shutting down a lot of those other problems. And so carbon emissions is the one thing where they can really like blame and guilt trip the West, and I think that's why it's being used more as a control scheme. Whereas if you're looking at these other environmental problems, we wouldn't really be blaming ourselves so much as having to help the rest of the world try to stop causing those problems.
Okay, excellent. So this is setting up some really good frames that we're going to be covering a myriad of topics and the causes behind them, and the reasons behind them, all this kind of stuff. But a lot of it's just about kind of balancing it, right? It's like, yes, we know, like, there's not too much here that's going to be like either this is totally the worst problem or it's not a problem at all. It's going to be more about, okay, these are all problems, but here's like the severity as it relates to, here's how they're portraying the severity. Here's probably more likely where we're at and what we should be focusing on. Because I notice you're saying, like, for example, just with the carbon emissions and climate change, it's like there's this phrasing of the biggest problem. They're saying it's the biggest problem. So it's like, well, we know it's a problem, but it's like, what are we really focusing on and why? So that's really good. So that helps me kind of frame it. And I'll let you take it away again from there. Very good.
Right. So as far as getting back to the climate change part, go ahead and bring up that second article that I sent you on the relationship between warming and carbon, because some of what we're being told about the climate change narrative is actually blatantly flat out wrong.
Sorry,
Um,
is that the Daily Skeptic? Which one is that?
uh,
Or is it the?
yeah, the Daily Skeptic article. Yep.
All right, all right. Okay, we're gonna do
Okay.
that. There it is. Got it.
All right. Yeah, so as we're looking at this article, basically this is going over the relationship between temperature and atmospheric carbon levels over the past few thousand years. And one of the things that we find when we actually look into that relationship is, we're being told that carbon emissions are the biggest driver of temperature changes, whereas it actually looks like while there is a relationship, there is a correlation there, the causal part of that relationship seems to be the other way around, where when you look at the historical graphs, changes in temperature happened first, and then changes in the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere happened after that. So what you see in our environment is as temperature changes, that affects how animals act, that affects the behavior of our oceans, that affects a whole lot of things that affect our atmosphere in both direct and indirect ways. So the changes in temperature will change wildlife activity and ocean activity, and that affects our atmosphere a lot more than changes in our atmosphere affect, temperature and wildlife and ocean activity.
Right.
So where there is a relationship there, there is a correlation there. The causation is the issue here, where they're saying that carbon emissions are driving temperature changes, but historically that's never happened. Carbon emissions have never been the driving cause of temperature changes throughout history. When we look at the historical graphs, it looks like temperature changes have caused changes in carbon levels rather than the other way around. So while there is a causal relationship, it looks like, you know, the causal relationship is the other way around. There is a correlation, but the cause is not what they're saying it is. The cause is the opposite of what they're saying it is.
Right.
And so we're being fed this narrative that the rising carbon emissions are going to be disastrous because it's going to cause temperature changes, but that's never happened. That's literally never happened throughout history. Carbon emissions and carbon levels in the atmosphere have never been the driving cause of temperature changes. They have always followed temperature changes.
So I want to
So
I want to interject for a second to ask like the obvious, maybe the obvious question, which is that what are some of those, like, if we're saying that carbon kind of goes up as a result of temperature going up, what are some of those things, like as temperature goes up, what are some of those things that then result naturally in carbon? Is it like volcanoes or something with algae in the ocean, or like how does that work?
Yeah, volcanoes are a small part of it. Ocean life is a much bigger part of it. So basically, carbon and oxygen in our atmosphere, plants and animals breathe. Plants breathe in carbon and breathe out oxygen, and animals breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon. So as temperature changes, as temperature goes up, you get a lot more animal activity because when it's warmer, in the colder parts of the world, animals can move around more. They don't hibernate for as long. When it gets colder, animals hibernate more. They don't move around as much. So wildlife behavior patterns. Those change. Ocean life patterns, their behavior patterns change. So as the behavior patterns of wildlife change, that has an effect on our atmosphere based on how much the plants and animals are breathing in and how much they're breathing out. And so that's historically been the biggest cause of changes in carbon levels in our atmosphere, not humanity. Now, obviously, we're in a new era now where we are burning a whole lot of fossil fuels. We are releasing a lot more carbon into the atmosphere. So it's possible that there are some unintended consequences because of that. But there's not really a whole lot of evidence that that's going to cause the kind of catastrophic temperature changes that are being predicted right now. And, the evidence really just isn't anywhere near as strong as the people who are pushing this narrative say that it is. And while they can prove that there is a correlation between temperature and carbon levels, the causal part of that relationship is the other way around. And so the evidence that carbon emissions are going to cause temperature changes is a lot weaker than the evidence that temperature changes can cause changes in carbon levels. So that's a pretty big part of their narrative, and they've got it completely backwards.
So I'm open to that, but I am going to play a little bit of the skeptic or the devil's advocate here, because I'm trying to think.
Mm-hmm.
So like I do wonder if what evidence or studies we could go off of to compare, like if we're talking about respiration being like across the plant and animal life, being the one of the core or the core factor in temperature rise, it kind of makes me wonder how to quantify that, because like you said, it's animals that are exhaling carbon, whereas plants are breathing in carbon. So you would think there's like a balance inherent in the nature to where there's not like an excess of that as a result. However, you can you just think about it in your mind, just anecdotally or conceptually. You just think about how many animals are out there, and try to imagine like the combined exhaling of all, like the net carbon exhaling of all the mammals or breathing, what's it called, respirating animals in the world, like just all that combined, and then subtract what all the plants in the world breathe in, including the algae in the ocean. So and then you think about the net carbon output as a result of that, and then compare that to like humanity's like fossil fuel burning emissions into the atmosphere across our planet, across our globe. It's like I don't know. Like to my mind, it's kind of like that's a tougher argument for me. I'd have to see we would, and then maybe we would, that's where we're going to get into. I'd have to see the numbers and the comparison for that because I don't know. It's the first time I've heard it, so I'm still processing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before. I didn't pull up any of the data on that for today, but from what I've seen, in the past, it looks like humanity's contribution to that is relatively small. Like, there's a ton of wildlife on Earth. It contributes, a ton of respiration. Um, so ocean life, I think, was the single biggest contributor to, you know, atmospheric changes. The last time I looked into that, it has been a few years. Maybe that's changed, but definitely humanity is not like responsible for a majority of carbon emissions. It's just that our activity has been the biggest change over the last few decades. So as we've seen atmospheric carbon levels go up a little bit, that is due to human activity, but we're still a small portion of the total like carbon output in the world's ecosystem.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
All right. But kind of in that vein, let's take a look at some of the other things that humanity is doing that are going to affect, the amount of carbon output out there. Pull up that third article I sent you, the Nature.com article about agriculture and climate change.
All right. And boom. And nature. 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture.
Yep. So we're people are focusing a lot on fossil fuels, and some of what they're talking about as far as the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are fossil fuel use in order to grow food. But a portion of that, it's not so much actually that agriculture is directly contributing to greenhouse gases so much as because we're changing the way that habitat is being used, because we're clearing out natural habitat and then planting crop fields and putting animals on them. Part of that is the carbon emissions from the changes in the way that habitat is being used, where we're destroying plant life and we're replacing it with more animal heavy, like livestock farms. Because livestock, while the CO2 emissions from livestock aren't necessarily that different, the methane emissions coming out of cows. I mean, cows who are raised in feedlots, they release a lot of methane. They don't have a very healthy diet, so they end up farting a lot. That's just the way it is. And methane actually is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So that's actually a more serious threat than a lot of the carbon that's being released by fossil fuels, because it is a more powerful greenhouse gas. And there's quite a bit more evidence of methane's ability to change temperature than there is of carbon dioxide's ability to change temperature. So as far as the actual man-made effect that we're having on climate change, fossil fuels are not as big a part of that as people like to give them credit for. Agriculture is a bigger part of that than people like to give it credit for. And unfortunately, the type of agriculture that we're doing now, when you look at industrialized agriculture, when you look at factory farms versus family farms, when you look at monocrop agriculture versus more diversified, sustainable agriculture. A lot of the practices that we're doing now, they're designed to feed as many people as possible with as little labor as possible, even if that hurts the health of both the individuals eating that food and the planet that we live on.
Right.
And so it's less, in some ways, it's less a matter of the carbon emissions that we're being told, and more a matter of the quality of the practices that we're using. So as we've switched to this more industrialized agriculture, as we switch to factory farms where, instead of grazing grass on open fields, where our agricultural practices kind of mimic nature and we're just, controlling and harvesting it, instead we're putting cattle in feedlots, we're putting animals in cages, we're keeping them, in a tight little box for the vast majority of their lives and feeding them basically agricultural waste products. And that's destroying their health, and because it's destroying their health, they're emitting a whole lot more noxious gases, and because they're emitting more noxious gases, that's having more of an impact on the environment than a lot of other things are. So the quality of our agricultural practices and the way that those practices have changed over the last few decades has actually been a bigger contributor to a lot of our environmental problems than just the use of fossil fuels has been. And that's an issue that people don't really want to talk about, because especially on the left, because the left, they've got this food stamp mentality. They've got this, we have to feed every single person, even if it means that, we're taking care of people who don't really contribute back into the system. Well, if you're taking care of the biggest number of people possible, regardless of whether they're contributing anything back into the system, and you're not taking good enough care of your workers, you're not, encouraging good workers who are going to do a good quality job. You're trying to just maximize the amount of care that you're taking of the maximum number of people possible. You kind of have to use those shitty practices. You kind of have to do the mass production where you have less labor going in but more product coming out. Well, of course, if you're doing that, you're going to be doing it in a dirtier way. You're going to be doing it in a more harmful way. And you're going to get a lower quality product as a result. So that's one of the things that's driving poor health is that we're focusing on quantity rather than quality. We're focusing on just, feed the maximum number of people, throw billions of dollars of food aid at Africa, regardless of whether or not they can actually, run a functional economy and take care of themselves.
Right.
Import the entire third world. Yeah, and so that sort of attitude of, maximizing the number of people that we feed rather than maximizing the quality of our food, and if that means, some amount of population control, whether that's immigration into the West, whether that's, birth rates, that sort of thing. But nobody really wants to have that conversation because it's not a very pleasant conversation.
Exactly. They just want to be the good guy who's saying, "Oh, let's just take care of everybody and let's have organic food for everybody." But like they're not assessing the equation. They're not doing the math, and they're not willing to have the conversations or the hard decisions. Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that we're going to get into later is kind of the amount of effort that it takes to produce sustainable food versus producing, unsustainable factory farmed food, as well as the amount of effort that it would take if we were to take the climate change argument seriously and completely redesign our energy infrastructure to have less emissions, how much more work that would take than, to continue using fossil fuels, and how the labor of trying to solve our environmental problems, how that goes into the equation basically, and how the kind of labor that we need and the amount of that labor that we need in order to solve our problems, what that means for our economy, and how we would actually have to change our lives in order to make a greener world.
Hell yeah. Yeah, awesome. Before we go on, I have a couple. So one is that, just with the cow farting like that, I've heard that narrative through the left and some of the mainstream, and obviously their solution is just kill cows, like subsidize farmers, pay them to kill their cows, which
eat the bugs.
Eat the bugs. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that? Like, is that a reasonable thing? We should cut back on the amount of cows we have, or is there just some better way to do it?
There's a much better way to do it. And so when you compare the emissions from cows that are grazed on open fields from grass-fed cows versus cows that are raised in feedlots and factory farm cages, the cows that are grazed on open fields have much lower methane emissions, way lower methane emissions. So they're not contributing anywhere near as much to, the greenhouse gas problem. Not only that, but they also help restore the land that they're feeding off of, basically, because when you have cattle go out into an open field, they eat the most overgrown areas first, and then they piss and shit everywhere and fertilize the land so that more stuff can grow.
Including
and
mushrooms.
Then when that stuff gets overgrown, they eat some more. So, cattle, they've been a part of the natural ecosystem for a long time, since a long time before we evolved them to be meat factories for our purposes, basically. And so even though, their role has changed a little bit from sort of herd animals in nature, they still behave in basically the same way that, a natural herd animal would, as long as we actually raise them in the right way, as long as we're herding them in the correct way. And so there have been people who've done studies on how cattle migrations basically affect the ecosystem. And basically, the more similar their grazing pattern is to the way that herd animals behave, out in nature, the better it is for the land. So what that means for us in terms of how we have to redesign our agricultural system is that means we need bigger pastures for the cattle to graze in, and we need to let them wander a little bit more freely on their own rather than trying to micromanage every single aspect of the food production. Definitely shouldn't be keeping them in small pens, shouldn't be keeping them in cages. So it's actually interesting that, like, the agricultural methods that would do the most good for the environment also happen to be better for the animals. And the fact that they're better for the animals also means that you usually end up getting a higher quality meat out of them.
Yes.
The one downside is that kind of open grazing, because because you have to do a lot more managing of the cattle when they're out there rather than just shoving them in a cage and forgetting about them except for feeding time, it does mean A, that you need more space per cow, and B, that you need more labor per cow. And so those are the two big expenses that go into it. And in order to make that work, you do have to have some population limitation because the more space that you're using for agriculture, the less space that you have for humans. So we do have to kind of rethink our relationship with nature, and that doesn't necessarily mean pull the population or anything, but it may mean putting people back into small towns so that there are more laborers out there doing that kind of work rather than
Yes.
packing everybody into the cities like sardines.
Yeah.
Um,
I wanted to
yeah.
say, you said earlier, you talked about how, like, obviously, like, it makes sense intuitively, cramming cows into these, like, very factory type, settings is going to be bad for the health of the environment. But obviously, like, just like you said too, the health of the meat, like their meat, I think there's been studies that show like the quality of their life, not only like how much fresh air are they getting, what are they eating, but also just like how happy they are. Isn't there like some memes about like
Mhm.
putting the VR headsets on the cows? It's like the most dystopian shit ever. But yeah, so like that, we all get that. And two other just like contextual things I wanted to bring back to is that this is a beautiful thing about what I think we're trying to build here is that it is about being natural and what is most natural, and there's so many components to that. And one of the funny thing is that even though a lot of what it means to kind of reconnect with nature kind of comes across in our current ideas like a right wing idea political spectrum, we are pushing for it's like in some regards we sound like PETA. We're like, no, get the cows out of cages, let them free roam, like because that shit's obvious. And it reminds me of that meme. I don't know if you've seen those memes where it's like the tug of war on a rope, and like the people
Mhm.
are tugging, and then they're surprised by who's on the same side as them. And on issues like these, we will agree with probably a lot of leftists or just liberal who are people who are into organic farming and stuff because it's just more natural, more healthy. The difference, like we've already
Yep.
alluded to, though, is that we're willing to have those hard conversations and we're willing to discuss the other factors like population restrictions, for example, which are going to be necessary. So very good.
Yeah, so there are going to be some hippies, some libertarians, some, homesteading types that are all going to have to basically get together on our side, pulling against the corporate elite and kind of the mainstream of both the left and the right. A lot of us who are in various dissident movements, whether it's left wing, right wing, libertarian, authoritarian, whatever, like if you're outside the norm for our political spectrum, almost regardless of what direction you're in, a lot of us are seeing the same problems with that system. And so, if we're going to be kind of looking to build a more localist or nationalist world where things are a little bit smaller scale and we're not trying to force global solutions on everyone, I think that we can bring some of those totally different movements together and have, tell the left wing hippies, well, you can have your hippie commune over there, and then right across the border from you might be, a white ethno state or a theocracy or something like that. And across the border from them is going to be, libertarian utopia where they've got, blackjack and hookers.
Yeah, yeah.
But as long as each of us are leaving the other communities alone to do their own thing, I think in a lot of ways that's going to be better. And the fact that we're going to have to take care of our own land rather than looking for these globalist one size fits all solutions. The more you're having to take care of your own land, the more you have to take responsibility for it, the better care you're going to take of it.
And that's a good point too. Is that it's always important to keep that spectrum in mind. Like, here's some things that we need to agree on larger scales, and then here down on this level, y'all do whatever you want. And if there's any issues that are going to be of global concern, it's going to be things like protecting our global like atmosphere, emissions, ecosphere, like and stuff like that. So I think that it's really interesting to me. We'll get more into that later or in other times about what that balance looks like, what kind of policies should be handled on larger scales, and what can we leave, and that'd be just a good perspective to keep in mind, and something I'm moving towards a lot is trying to collaborate across the spectrums and across the political boundaries with issues that it makes sense to do so. So very good.
Mhm. Well, and it's interesting that you put it that way in terms of the atmosphere being something that we have to deal with globally, because I think that is part of why they're trying so hard to control that as an issue is that it does give them an excuse to implement solutions on a global scale.
Yeah.
And of course, they're distorting the issue in order to implement the solutions that they want to implement rather than to implement correct solutions that are good for the rest of us. Because the correct solution would be to put things more on a local level
Yeah.
and have people taking better care of their own land.
It's just like it's the same way that like a national government tries to stir up conflict and wars because that's where they're needed. That's like one of the only things that they're needed for. And likewise, on the United Nations and all these like international groups are like trying to like that because that's the thing that we all need to come together for to make sure But it's so. And it's not to say that we still do need to handle things at that level the best we can, but we got to be careful because we know how they're gonna try to let it go to their heads. They're gonna try to get out of control of the power. So we also, as part of that discussion, need to make sure we have the right mechanisms in place to keep them in check. That kind of stuff. So that'll be part of it.
Yeah, because the people in power are always going to be pulling that kind of problem reaction solution stuff to try and take control of more than what they really have the right to.
Right. Yep.
All right. Well, that pretty much covers a lot of the problems with, what we've been told about the environment so far. So let's move on to the next part, which is to give people who are a little bit more skeptical of environmentalism a little bit better idea of just what nature does for us and why we do actually need somewhat of an environmentalist movement to take care of it. So go ahead and pull up. Whoops, I think I sent you the wrong link there. Hold on. Here. Okay.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about the links too is I'm really just kind of showing them briefly. We're obviously not like reading it word by word, just kind of showing here's the article we're talking about. We will include these in the comments or the description and so forth as well to refer to. It's mostly just for reference, I think, too.
Okay, yeah. So pull up that Science Direct article I just sent you.
Alrighty. Let's see here. Boom, boom. And yep, should be up. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So scroll down to where the abstract is, and it'll show you basically estimates for how much our ecosystem provides to humanity in terms of the services it provides. Back in the 90s, the estimates were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 to 50 trillion. Today, the estimates are, well, I guess in 2011, when this was published, the estimates were over 100 trillion a year, up to almost 150 trillion a year. In today's dollars, of course, with inflation, it's probably closer to 200 trillion a year. And that's basically just an estimate of how much value the ecosystem provides to us. So when you consider like fish reproducing in the ocean, we go out and fish them. Well, that's a whole bunch of value that we just got out of the ecosystem. Trees grow on their own. You don't really have to do anything to get trees to grow, but you go and cut them down. Well, that's something that the ecosystem provided to us. The plants and natural habitat helps regulate our atmosphere so that we have cleaner air to breathe. Pulling toxins out of the air, putting oxygen back into the air. That's a service that's provided to us. So if our ecosystem disappeared tomorrow and we basically had to completely provide for ourselves and make up for all of the things that the ecosystem was providing to us, we would be looking at a couple $100 trillion a year at this point of services that humanity would have to provide for ourselves. And that is significantly bigger than the size of the global economy. So we would basically have to do multiple times as much work as we're doing now in order to take care of ourselves at the same quality of life that we're getting now, thanks to basically the things that our ecosystem provides to us for free.
Hell yeah. I love that. I've never seen a number like that, but it makes sense. It's an astounding number because ultimately, pretty much everything we do is it derived from the earth, and if it's not directly derived like from materials or resources, then it's almost like obviously like just the ability to breathe the air and this kind of thing, like things that water, like things that aren't even necessarily always charged for. And I think this perspective is so good to actually, because our society operates so heavily in terms of money and monetary value, but we don't ever think about this value that the earth is giving. So this is a great way to kind of like reconnect that back together, because up to this point, it's mostly about, well, who can extract the most, who can reap the most and almost do the most harm. And then there's also this other discussion too about who owns those resources. It's like this idea that someone owns this piece of land, therefore they own all these resources that's being extracted from the earth. But ultimately, it is the earth, and there are some perspectives out there about it reminds me, this is just a whole other tangent that we won't go into, but just talking about, like, for example, Andrew Yang's, like, his UBI program was called the Freedom Dividend. And I kind of almost like this idea of like an earth dividend, like where, if we're taking care of earth and, we're establishing that relationship, it would be nice to be able to tie that economically in. And rather than these people these elites who have just managed to exploit and control resources, kind of open that up a little bit. And it's not a full on like communist, everyone gets everything for free, but it is a little bit of a balancing mechanism. So anyway, I just wanted to
Sort of, if you have like a homestead and you're doing permaculture, or if you have a ranch and you're grazing your animals openly, or giving people like a subsidy for doing things in a more sustainable way. Is that what you're kind of suggesting there?
Yeah, something like that for sure. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think in theory that's good. Unfortunately, anytime you build a system like that, you're going to have people try to find a way to game the system and exploit it. So you will see corporations be like, well, how can we, make a tiny little tweak that doesn't really improve things much, but gets us huge amounts of money
that sounds
back.
really dystopian. Man, like I'm thinking about, like, you've got these homesteads, but they're actually just like corporate mechanisms to look like the way. So it's like such a perversion of it. It's like, here's these people living on a farm, but it's actually like a corporate project. That sounds dystopian as fuck. Anyway, it's just a side.
It does, but yeah, unfortunately, when you look at things like farm subsidies, you've got people like Bill Gates, who's got billions of dollars in the bank getting farm subsidies because he bought up a bunch of farmland, and he's just getting millions of dollars from the government simply for having bought up a bunch of land. And yeah, it's kind of sick how things that are intended to be good for the environment, for people's health, end up being twisted and perverted into something that's ends up being destructive in the long run.
Yeah, that spirals into a whole other discussion about incentives and economies and how you get how you do that, which that'll be a future conversation for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's see. So the next article I sent you, it's another one from The Guardian. Yeah, that one on Earth has lost a third of its arable land. Go ahead and pull that one up.
Oopsie. There it is. Yep.
All right. So, the Earth has lost about a third of its arable land, and that's basically land that is good to use for farmland, and also, provides good natural habitat, I guess, basically, if it's not being used for farmland. So the fact that we've lost about a third of like high quality food producing land due to things like soil erosion, groundwater depletion and contamination, basically over farming it in ways that are not sustainable, that's a huge problem, and that's something that's going to threaten our ability to survive in the long run if that trend continues. And I mean, this article is a few years old, and nothing really has changed a whole lot. As far as I'm aware, in terms of the way that we're managing land, that would cause any kind of an improvement in that. So, a lot of the problems that we've already been talking about today, as far as how the agricultural practices that we're using are not sustainable, this is the end result of that, is that we've lost a lot of the land that can be used for farmland, and so now we have to manage the land that we have a lot better if we want to keep it. And if we're not doing that, we could be heading towards a sort of a food scarcity kind of collapse, where if we have too little farmland that we're trying to grow too much food on, and the fact that we're trying to grow too much food on it with unsustainable practices means that it just degrades that much faster. At what point do we reach a point where we can no longer actually produce enough food to feed people?
Yeah, and what I started to think about is like how how would that play out? And the way I imagine it playing out is that it's probably a lot of the land, man, and this ties into a whole other discussion, but basically like the land in a lot of the third world countries, you've got Monsanto and stuff going in there. You've got a lot of they're not really great about their practices and making sure that their soil isn't eroding and that it is sustainable. So it's probably a lot of their land that goes first. But at the end of the day, it probably is a lot of the first world that continues to get the food. And so it's going to be those poor countries that struggle. And then what? Well, that's going to pressure them to basically start invading and immigrating to the first world, which is already a problem we're having now. So that's probably how we're going to see this manifest. And we're already probably seeing it manifest right now because of that.
We definitely are, yeah.
And so whether or not, and it makes me think, is there some kind of global gentrification that could happen where like the first world then leaves and goes and tries to make these other places that have been abandoned better? Is there any technological way to overturn this? It's going to get rough. It's likely going to get worse before it gets better, and we're going to learn some lessons the hard way. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay. Yeah, and that's definitely a good point, as far as the ramifications of what these problems are, because a lot of people, they kind of, if you're living in a city, you feel very disconnected from the environment. So sometimes these environmental problems may seem like, oh, they're way over there somewhere, they're not affecting us.
Right.
But if you've got a bunch of migrants from the third world who've moved into your country because their country's ecosystem is, been trashed by unsustainable practices and they can't survive there, and now they're looking for somewhere else to go, that does affect you. It just takes a couple steps to get there. And so, these are things where, we have, in a way, we have to do that thinking globally but acting locally thing that, a lot of people on the left say, but that then gets twisted into pushing a lot of bullshit. But we have to do a very real version of that where, we realize that some of our local problems are being caused by, this global corporatist empire that's destroying ecosystems around the world. Um,
Yeah,
but
I just had a quick aside, again about that relationship to the left and how we're doing a lot of the things the same as them, but they do not want to make the hard decisions or have the hard questions. It's kind of funny.
mhm,
It makes me think of like a just like a typical male or female relationship, like in a marriage, for example, and even some situations I've been in my marriage, which is that like a lot of times women, yeah, they don't want to make those hard decisions, but they will let the men handle, like, kind of do it and just kind of wash their hands of it. So maybe we could create a relationship like that with the left where it's like we will be the bad guys and we will do the hard thing as long as y'all kind of like let us do it. Right? Just
yeah, I mean, we'll man up and solve the problem, but they're gonna have to kind of
let
sit
us do
back and
it.
support us and play
Yes.
that supportive
well
role, even
well
though they don't necessarily like every decision we're making. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think, and this is a whole other discussion about the gender dynamic, which is I think that's the healthy way is that the left, the women does kind of take a support role, not necessarily a submissive role, but more of a support role if they're willing to trust the men to lead, and I think that could play out in the left right dynamic. So again, another discussion, but a good point. Yeah.
It's actually really cool that you brought that up because we will be getting into a bit of how gender dynamics affects this before we're done. But let's
Sweet.
go on to. I got one other point to make before we really jump into that. So go ahead and pull up that uns.com article that I sent you, which this is an article that I wrote a few years ago, kind of laying out a lot of what we're talking about today. But I just wanted to show you a couple graphics from that. So that first graph up at the top of how much ocean plastic, how much ocean trash comes from different areas of the world. So you see there, Asia contributes about 86% of the plastic and trash that ends up in our oceans.
Wow.
Africa contributes 7.8%. South America contributes 4.8%. Central and North America contributes just under 1%. Europe about a quarter of a percent, and Australia in the Pacific, tiny fraction of a percent. So you're looking at white majority countries, the northern part of North America and Europe contributing roughly 1% of ocean trash, while black and brown and yellow countries are contributing almost like 99% of it,
But they're like
basically.
white, but yet they're still gonna say like whites are bad, whites are the problem and stuff. Yeah.
Right. And so, part of the reason that they're pushing the climate change narrative, part of it is about global control, part of it is also about white guilt.
Right.
And, when you look at the way that we manage our countries, even if we don't have a perfect record on the environment, even if sometimes, we kind of export some of our problems to the rest of the world in some ways, we at least do a much better job of trying to take care of our own country, trying to keep our own country clean. And we do at least have people who push for, not that our regulations are anywhere near perfect or anything like that, but we do have some regulations in place that do keep us from contributing to a lot of the worst of the problems that we're seeing. Obviously, there are corporations that can sort of bribe their way into getting around that, but when you look at the impact that we're having, certainly on ocean trash, we are definitely not the problem. Asia is the big problem on that. As I mentioned earlier, when you look at who's contributing the most to deforestation and wildlife loss, that's mostly kind of Africa and Latin America, then Asia, and then Europe and the U.S. we've got protections in place. We've got, national parks. We've got land that's been set aside as habitat that we're not allowed to mess with, and so we do a much better job of protecting the habitat that we have left. Maybe we didn't always do as good of a job, historically, like during the sort of industrialization process, but we're definitely doing a much better job of it now, and that's something where white people, we saw that there was a problem. We did what we could to solve it. Maybe there's more that we could do to solve it at this point, more that we need to do. But we're definitely doing a lot better job than what we're being given credit for. So the whole white guilt narrative that's being pushed on us, we definitely need to reject that, because if we're going to solve these environmental problems, white people care about things. White people, we like having a clean environment to live in, and I think that we're going to be leading the way on solving the environment. Whereas when you look at a lot of other parts of the world, they're so busy struggling to survive that they don't really care what happens to the environment in the process. Whereas, we're at that point where we've built a strong enough civilization that we can care, and we do care. Uh, and anyway, one more point before we move on. Go ahead and scroll down. There's a graphic from the World Wildlife Fund on some of the causes of wildlife loss. So once you pull that up, you'll see, as far as the various animal categories go, climate change is a very, very small portion of wildlife loss. Like less than 10% of wildlife loss is caused by climate change. A much bigger percentage is caused by habitat destruction. A much bigger percentage is caused by exploitation, like direct, hunting and fishing. Uh, More is caused by invasive species and by pollution than by climate change. So where we're given this narrative that climate change is, the big bad thing that we all have to stop, well, when you look at how it's actually affecting our environment, climate change is like next to nothing in terms of what's causing wildlife loss. Whereas a lot of these other things that we've been talking about, as far as how we use natural habitat, how agriculture is affecting wildlife and the environment, those are much bigger issues. So we need a complete, total, uh, basically paradigm shift in how we look at environmental issues, because this narrative of, oh, let's just focus on climate change and carbon emissions, that's causing us to completely ignore much bigger, much more dangerous problems. And I think this graph does a pretty good job of displaying how climate change is next to nothing in terms of what the actual causes of our environmental problems are, and we need to basically make a huge shift in how we're looking at things and how we're doing things in order to solve the real problems that we're causing.
Hell yeah. I wanted to say, as part of that, just talking about this larger paradigm shift that's needed, and how we could potentially position ourselves to lead that, or to basically be a driving force in that, and even considering the name of the article you wrote, like the Green New Right, which I love that. And I wanted to throw in that one of the kind of the latest project of mine, like before I got involved with the institute and before I created the Natural Order as kind of like that kind of thing. My latest project was very similar, and actually called it. I think I just called it New Earth. New Earth. It was this kind of this. It was about crafting a vision for like a new Earth, and like what it looks like from a global society down to like a local, and considering, of course, like all things environment, ecosystem, and natural, but also too, of course, like the most natural political and cultural behaviors to go along with that. And so I'm just really excited, because this is just very much the area that I like to operate. I'm happy to see that you're operating here, and yeah, it's a good place to be, and a needed place, like an absolutely essential place to be.
Hmm. All right, well, I guess that's going to bring us to kind of the solutions and thinking about, because a lot of what caused my paradigm shift in thinking, like roughly a decade or so ago, I was a little bit more in like the mainstream environmentalist movement, but I started thinking to myself about, well, if we're going to solve these problems, what would it take to solve them? And so, as I started to research into that and looked at, like, well, what kind of labor is needed if we want to, if we actually do want to move away from fossil fuels and towards more renewables, how's that going to affect the economy? What kind of labor changes are going to be needed? And so that next link that I sent you from aei.org, about the amount of labor needed to produce the same amount of energy. So they've got this comparison here between coal, natural gas, and solar, where the same amount of energy that one coal worker can produce, you need two natural gas workers to produce the same amount of energy, or almost 80 solar workers to produce the same amount of energy that one coal worker can produce.
Wow.
Yeah. And wind energy is like pretty similar to solar. Some people some people want to suggest nuclear as an alternative. Excuse me. And I'm not going to say that nuclear is a bad alternative. It obviously has some side effects, like the risk of meltdowns, like we saw in Fukushima and Chernobyl. There's nuclear waste, so it does have its side effects. But relative to other environmental sources, it's kind of hard to say exactly what the problems are. How those problems relate to each other. A lot of the studies that have been done trying to kind of compare the costs of each type of energy have obviously overestimated the importance of carbon emissions, and so they all say, "Oh, fossil fuels are worse, and it's totally worth the labor to go with other things." And totally worth the risk of nuclear. I'm not so sure of that, and I think if you take carbon emissions out of the equation or you kind of lower their importance relative to the minimal amount of harm that they actually do, I think you will find that fossil fuels are generally safer and require a lot less labor than renewables and nuclear. But where renewables require a lot more labor to produce the same amount of energy, nuclear doesn't so much require more labor as a much higher quality of labor. Where, a nuclear physicist has to have a really good education and really know what they're doing in order to not, not be a danger. Uh, Whereas, a coal or oil worker doesn't need anywhere near the same education, doesn't need anywhere near as high an IQ in order to keep from causing problems, and the kind of problems they can cause are not on anywhere near the same level as a nuclear meltdown. So you've kind of got, as far as, solving the sort of fake problem of carbon emissions, the two solutions that we're given are either go with solar and wind energy and hydro energy and more renewables, which takes a lot more labor and a lot more hard, like, physical labor. You need a lot more construction workers, electricians, engineers, manufacturing workers to build the parts. Or you go with nuclear energy, in which case you need a much higher quality worker. You need a much more educated worker. You can't just bring in 1 million refugees from the third world and put them to work in a nuclear power
No,
plant.
you can't.
You
It's
would have
just not going to go
meltdowns everywhere.
well.
Yeah, like you would end up causing a nuclear meltdown
Yeah,
of
well, yeah. You have a
society at
nuclear
that point.
meltdown, and you find out the project manager was like a diversity hire or something.
Yeah, you do not want your diversity hires running your nuclear power plants. I'm
So,
sorry.
I was gonna
Uh,
say, yeah, nuclear was on my mind earlier. I've gained a positive impression of nuclear from some friends. I'm not too versed. Of course, there's always that scary factor of like Chernobyl and Fukushima. I get the impression that, like, given certain factors, blah blah blah, and what we've learned from those incidents, that like there's a very very low risk, and that may be worth looking into again. But and that seems to be where we're going inevitably, because maybe there will be some breakthrough with solar, wind, or geothermal or something like that. But ultimately, I mean, obviously, with non-renewables, with fossil fuels, they're going to run out. So one question I had, I don't know if you know, what does that projection look like? Like at our current usage and growth rate, and our reliance on non-renewables, when would we run out? I mean, do we know? It feels like
um,
would we run out?
yeah, so basically every decade someone will come along and say, "Oh, we're nearing peak oil, and prices are going to skyrocket, and there's not going to be enough to go around," and then we find new sources of it. So it's really hard to estimate. It also There's some indication that oil is a more renewable resource than we believe,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of those oil reserves, like, we're sitting here being told that these are like hundreds of thousands of years old, oil that's been buried forever, but there are natural processes that cause oils to seep into the ground, sit there in those sediment layers and sort of build up over time.
Right.
So it's hard to like, we're probably pulling out oil faster than it's able to renew, but it's hard to say by how much, or how soon that's going to cause it to run out. But
Yeah.
as far as, we've seen almost as many estimates that have been wrong of how soon we're going to hit peak oil or start running out of oil, as we've seen climate change predictions that have
Right.
been wrong.
Right.
So I don't want to be too much of an alarmist in that direction. But even if you're looking at, replacing that with so-called renewables or with nuclear energy, well, we've got a limited amount of uranium and other, nuclear elements that we can use for nuclear power plants. We've got a limited amount of the rare earth metals that we need to make solar panels and wind
So what
turbines.
we need
Oh.
is a Dyson sphere around the sun.
Well, that'd be nice, but that would also take a huge amount of resources. So those are the realistic things that somebody's got to dig through in order to solve this, and I don't think that there's any one solution that's going to be perfect. I think right now, continuing to use fossil fuels for the solid majority of our energy needs is honestly the only economically sustainable way to go. There's no real way to make renewables really economically feasible when it takes dozens of times as much labor to produce the same amount of energy. If we want to make nuclear feasible, we need a more educated workforce, and we're not going to get that when we're importing the entire third world that all come from countries with poor education systems and
Yeah, and
lower
plus
average
the
IQ.
university is just like hiring. Yeah, it's just affirmative action and giving them all. And plus the universities suck in general. There's just so many problems that tie in together.
Yeah, our universities have kind of turned into propaganda camps rather than actual education centers. So
Yeah,
yeah, we're we're not getting as high a quality of worker out of our universities as we used to.
it's gonna be
And so those
bad.
are things that are going to prevent us from making nuclear a really feasible energy source in the near future. Because we're just not producing enough of that high quality, well educated worker that can go into fields like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely, I just wanted to
So
keep reminding that, like, again, like the population dynamic should always be a part of this. We need to be looking at these factors over here, like what's our supply, and trying to balance out our population. And, of course, like those discussions about population are like, that's a whole other thing too about trying to limit population or trying to grow it. Certain countries have generational collapses coming, and that's the justification for importing from the third world. And you can't control people's ability to have children, and how does abortion play into so again, a huge whole other topic, but worth constantly
right.
keeping that in mind. Yeah.
Well, and it is the countries that, for all the problems with our education system, we still have better education systems in the West than they have in most of the third world.
Right.
And yet we're the countries that are cutting off, childbirth and don't have anywhere near as many kids being born and raised in that education system. So,
Yeah, I'm thinking.
how
I'm
deep?
thinking that just like those like bare bones population demographics combined with like what the elites are doing with our institutions and our infrastructure just makes me think of the movie Idiocracy. Like it's just absolute dysgenic, like de-evolution. It's not a pretty picture. So
Yeah, and they're trying to create as dysgenic a society as they can because they can't rule over a well-educated society anywhere near as well as they can rule over a society of idiots.
yeah, and this is what when you're talking about when you're talking about future casting and stuff, and a lot of us are seeing that it's probably going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. But at least when that happens, in the same way that, for example, the Nazis happened, and everyone's like, "Oh, look at what happens when the right takes power." Well, look at what happens when the left takes power, and that's going to be the new thing that's going to set the stage for the next couple hundred years. Like, wow, we need to, they're going to be like,
Hmm.
yeah, like Soros and them are going to be the new like Hitler. Like, look at what he did. Like, he fucking almost genocided and destroyed our whole entire planet because of their dumb
Yeah,
policies. And then we get to be
which
hopefully we get to
really,
be the heroes to turn that boat around.
yeah, you can look at Mao and Stalin and already see that they did way worse things when, the far left egalitarian extremists took power than
Right.
anything that Hitler did.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
At
not that
least
I
the
like,
Nazis were able to eat. I mean, at least they had food. Unlike the
yeah,
fucking
they had
communists.
food. I mean, would you rather have the quick death that you would get in a concentration camp if they decided to kill you, or would you rather be
Starved to death.
starved to death
Yeah.
slowly
We had a
while watching
conversation.
everyone that you ever knew starve to death
Yeah,
with you?
I think I actually had it, because I had a conversation with the guy recently. This is again getting off topic. We'll get back on topic, but I had a conversation with the guy, and he was kind of like just taking me on a deeper dive into the Holocaust experience and what actually happened and why and this kind of stuff. And it was kind of like truly the gases and some of the ways they did it was the most humane option given the parameters of the war and the situation. Like, and I remember having that discussion about like I know I would rather just be either shot or whatever rather than starve to death. So, but anyway, that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
That is a whole other topic we'll have to save for another time.
Yep.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to that. Well, actually, before we get to that next link, let me kind of set the stage for that a little better. So when we're looking at how to solve these problems, we've talked a little bit about the kind of labor and the amount of labor that we need as far as fixing our energy infrastructure. But of course, if we're focusing on as much like agriculture and forest management and things like that as being part of the solution, that basically when you're looking, regardless of which of those solutions you're looking at, whether you're looking at using a whole lot of construction work to completely redesign our energy infrastructure and replace everything with solar and wind power, or whether you're looking at fixing our agricultural system and having more cattle grazing on open lands, having more permaculture, which you can't necessarily harvest a permaculture field the same way that you would harvest a monocrop field. You can't use the same amount of machinery. You have to use a lot more hand labor. So one way or another, the solution to our environmental problems is going to require a lot of work, and it's going to require hard physical labor, whether you're talking about construction work or whether you're talking about agriculture and forestry work. Both of those are, very physically demanding jobs. So go ahead and pull up that BLS.gov, the first of those links that I sent you about fatal incident rates by job type.
Yep.
So you're looking at that graph, and construction has like the highest total death toll of any industry, or any major industry category, I guess I should say. Agriculture is third place. So two of the deadliest industries. If you scroll down to the bottom there and click on Show Table, it'll pull up not just the number of injuries, but the fatal injury rate per 100,000 full-time workers. And when you look at the rates per worker, agriculture is the deadliest industry by deaths per hour worked, with like almost 20 deaths per 100,000 workers. Construction is in third place. So construction is the highest total death toll. Agriculture is the highest death toll per hour worked, compared to things like education and health services. Not even one death per per 100,000 workers. Basically, the safest industry to be in. So think about, we just make a point as far as the COVID thing, where we were all told, oh, we got to care so much about our service workers and our healthcare workers and how they're taking all these risks with the pandemic, and yet they've got the about the lowest industry death toll. I guess retail trade is like third lowest as far as the rate. So those are some of the safest industries to be in. Meanwhile, the people that they're asking to go completely rebuild our entire energy infrastructure in order to solve climate change have the highest total death toll. The people that we're going to be asking to help redesign our agricultural industry, they have the highest death rate per hour worked. And so the people that we're going to be asking to solve our environmental problems are going to be doing some of the most difficult, dangerous, and dirty jobs that are out there in order to put food on our tables and roofs over our heads. Right. And they're already doing it. We just need more people doing it in a little bit different way. And so, we need an economy that's going to be moving in that direction, that's going to have more people doing those kinds of jobs. But we also need to have the proper level of respect for the people who are doing those jobs. Because if we're asking people to work harder at jobs that, that can kill you, that have a lot of risks, that take a toll on people, we have to have the proper level of respect for the people who are doing those jobs. We have to have an economy that takes better care of them. We did an episode a couple episodes ago about basically how much money has been stolen from the average American worker to give to those people working in the financial service industry, which, again, has a very low death rate. They're not taking the risks, but they're taking all the rewards. And so we do need an economy that's going to, basically stop redistributing money away from the hardworking class and to the rich, at least, and possibly even redistribute more money towards the hardworking class in order to properly reward them for what we're going to be asking them to do to save the environment. But I think we do need to have a national conversation about, the risks that go into what we're being asked to do to solve our environmental problems. And the same wealthy elites are the ones that are pushing the climate change narrative and saying, well, we need 80 times as many people working in the energy industry, doing construction work and electrical work and manufacturing work in order to build solar panels and wind turbines. And those same people are spitting on the flyover states and don't really have the proper amount of respect for the working class people that they're asking to do those jobs. And so we really need to bring that conversation to them and demand that they have the proper level of respect for us and that they listen to our voices on these kinds of things.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I see that a lot. I've grown to have a lot of respect for blue-collar workers and men in those industries. And it's funny because that's a big part of it, too, the men-women thing. Like, you've got women who are typically probably more prone to complain, the left, who, like, complain a lot and make it all the attention about them. But you've got these it's like men out there, like, doing the risky and dirty jobs and stuff. And that is a big part of it. Of course, a lot of it's just economics and other things, but the perception and the respect and that a lot of that stuff matters. We need to be, these are heroes. I mean, these are like the backbone of our country. And like you said, the left, the people who are in cities and so separate from this stuff, and they think all these like conservative men are the problem, but they're wholly dependent on it. Well, these conservative men in these rural areas don't need the city. They don't need liberals. They don't need financial services. They don't need any of that crap. Whereas it's the
Yeah.
other way around, very much needed. Um, and the other,
Yeah, the guys driving pickup trucks are the ones that are building, they're the ones that put a roof over your head.
I know, yeah, it's really warped. It just goes to show how out of touch with reality they are in nature that they are. But the other thing I wanted to say too, just in terms of where we might be looking going forward, a huge factor in all of this is again technology. It's always worth coming back to technology, in that with a combination of AI and robotics, and I've already seen a good bit of articles about some of these machines that can work. That can like do actually crop related activities. Say when you talk about like permaculture and more complexity and needing manual labor, I thought about what if technology could help fill the gap there. But yeah, it won't be the full picture. It's only a part of the puzzle and something to consider.
Yeah, and hopefully technology can help us solve things, but sometimes technology is a double-edged sword, because the same technology that might provide you a new solution is also, creating the machines that made monocrop agriculture take the place of permaculture.
Right.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
you
Ultimately, it's a
yeah, you never
cultural
know.
issue.
Yeah, the cultural issue is probably bigger. But yeah, I don't want to go all Ted Kaczynski here or anything, but sometimes technology has, it has unintended consequences, and you have to be careful with how you're using it.
Yep.
Um,
Agree.
yeah. Well, anyway, go ahead and pull up that last link that I sent, the other one from BLS.gov. And this one is basically the demographics of various labor groups. So go ahead and hit Control F and search for construction. And it'll be like the second category with construction, not construction managers, but like natural resources, construction, and maintenance occupations.
Yep. Got it.
Okay. So when you're looking at those columns to the right of it, that first one is the number of thousands of workers in the industry. The second one is the percentage of those workers who are female. So when you look at, natural resources, construction, and maintenance occupations overall, which basically every one of the jobs that we're talking about needing more people to do in order to solve our environmental problems fall into, that broad category. And that the gender breakdown of that is like 94% male and 5.7% female. So, you've got more than 10 times as many men as women working in those industries.
Yep.
So there is a huge gender breakdown when it comes to the kind of jobs that we're going to need people to do in order to, in order to fix our environmental problems. When you break that down a little further, so construction workers specifically, 4.2% female. So they're more than 20 times as male as they are female. And, so if the left is going to be asking us to completely redesign our energy infrastructure, it's going to be like more than 95% men doing the work of that. And the more difficult and complicated the jobs are, which, building wind turbines and installing solar panels is more complicated, those jobs are even more male. So, like electricians, only 2.2% female. Well, you need a lot of electricians to redesign our energy infrastructure. It's going to be almost entirely men doing that work. There's going to be very few women doing it. As far as the agricultural side of things, that's a little bit more balanced, partly because you have a lot of like farmers' wives who are, included in the labor of the farm. So that's roughly like three-fourths male and one-fourth female. But when you look at some of the more like difficult and dangerous jobs in that, so like logging is the single deadliest occupation in America. That right now, this is saying it's 6.5% female. Um, Past like versions of this that I've looked at actually had an even lower female percentage than that. I've seen it as low as 2% in previous
You're like,
years.
why aren't they doing diversity hires in that field? Huh? Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, the gender breakdown of these jobs is very much, very heavily leaning towards men doing the most difficult, dangerous, and dirty jobs, and women doing relatively safe and easy jobs if they even go to work for as long as their men do,
Yeah.
which in a lot of cases they don't want to. And so when we're talking about, the kind of labor that we need in order to save the world, the typical person who's going to be doing that is going to be male, and not just male, but like a very masculine male, and not not some emasculated beta male from from the left.
Right.
So obviously that doesn't mean that women don't have a part to play, but as far as our message to women on this, your role is not to grab a hammer and go out there and do the same work as a man. Your role in this is to find a man who is doing one of those
And be
difficult,
supportive.
dangerous, and
Yeah.
dirty jobs, who's doing his part to put food on your table and a roof over your head, and trying to, because we need more people doing that in order to do it sustainably, in order to do it in a way that's healthy for our planet and for us. And so we need the kind of culture that encourages women to find that kind of man and be supportive, because every one of the men doing that kind of job would be happier coming home to a home where the woman is cleaned it, the woman's got a meal ready. And if we can create the kind of economy where women can go back to their job being to support their man rather than to go
Make
work at some
PowerPoints.
corporation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we could return to that kind of economy, you'd see plenty of men who would be a lot happier to go to work at these kinds of jobs, who would put in a better quality work if they knew that they'd be coming home to a woman who's taking care of their home and their kids, and whose job in life is to help to take care of their needs. They could take care of the planet's needs a lot better if they have that kind of support. And unfortunately, we have the kind of social system right now that's set up to kind of brainwash women into not wanting that and into thinking that that's the worst thing that they could possibly do, when the reality is that the people who are going to be saving our world from the environmental problems we're facing,
Yeah.
they need that.
Well, even
They
for
need
men
that in order
too.
to-
Even for men too, it's like especially with our generation was really bad. They gotten a little bit better about it, but our generation, they're like, go to college and get these white collar jobs and sell insurance versus like go be a tradesman and go be like an industrial, like go be like an electrical engineer or like yeah. So and the other thing I wanted to come back to as well is like this male to female imbalance in these actual fields. I think is definitely, I'm sure it warps our culture and our political discussions, especially the left versus the right. The left being heavily like more feminine and female. Again, they're very detached from the realities of a lot of these kind of things, and so that just warps their perspective all the more. But yeah, in general, definitely on the right track.
Yeah, because a man and woman doing, a human resources job, okay, yeah, they're basically equal at that. But a man and woman building a house, obviously the average man is going to be a lot better at that than the average woman. A man and woman, planting a field, trying to wrangle cattle, obviously men are going to be better at that than women are,
Wow,
at
I
least on
can't believe
average.
you just said that. That's sexist. That's so sexy. Yeah, you're not supposed to
It
identify
is, but
differences, but it's true.
yeah, but the reality is sexist, and we have
Exactly.
to face that reality. Like, literally, our survival as a species and our ability to maintain our ecosystem that we depend on for life depends on us becoming more sexist. It depends on us recognizing, and some of this, in a way, hurts men because we have to tell men, look, you got to go out there and you got to do the difficult, dangerous, and dirty job so that your woman can stay safe at home taking care of it.
It's like that one
And
meme. It's like
that
my hands look like this, so hers can look like that, or whatever.
Right, and like we are asking a lot of men, and we have to ask a lot of men,
Yeah.
to
But that's the
to
thing
take
too
on
is
this
like
risk.
again like a lot of it boils down to the economics of it and how much you're making and stuff. But again, a huge part of it is the cultural appreciation. And our culture right now is fucking hates men, especially white men. And so we need to get back to like praising men for like the work that they're doing. And also like you said too about sexism, just like racism and anything else, like all these are is basically you're just discerning the differences, you're discriminating. Basically you're able to see the differences between them, and that's all it is. There's so much is that's a whole other discussion too. There's so much packed into these words, and that they're inherently negative words if you are able to tell the difference between A and B. But yeah, like you said, I mean the survival of our species contingents upon our ability to recognize the patterns and to align properly and naturally with it. Yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, we do need to ask this of men to basically go out there and do their part for the ecosystem, and not just for the ecosystem, but for us as us as individuals, to put food on our table and roofs over our heads and power in our outlets, and to do it in a way that's not going to destroy the world. And in order to do that, we also have to ask women to do their part and find one of the men who's heroically doing what needs to be done to provide for us and save the world, and take care of him.
Hell
And
yeah.
so That's our solution. Our solution is, give people give men the kind of job that's going to take care of society and the ecosystem that we depend on, and give women the kind of role in life where they find a man that they can and should be proud of, and we have the kind of culture that makes them proud of him, and expect them to, do what it takes to take care of him. And that's really the solution to our, our ecological problems, and it starts at home. It starts
Yeah.
with a good home life and
And,
a good,
and
yeah.
you say give too, but like obviously we're not trying to do handouts. We're really more than anything we're just trying to encourage. Like we're trying to align our cultural values with these kind of things. Like hey, let's encourage women, to be like to be proud to be mothers and to work in the house. Whereas again, there's been this whole undermining culture of more independence, and there is some things to be said there for that. And then again, men encourage them to go out and work and get their hands dirty and this kind of thing. But all in more in general, just build a culture and encourage just nature and these values that we're talking about, and just an awareness of the reality of the situation we're in. Cut through the lies, cut through the propaganda, cut through the politics and the industrial complexes, and see what's the situation we're in. Where do we need to be? How do we get there? There you go. And that's what we're doing here. So
Yep. And the way that we're going to save nature is to get back to a more natural lifestyle.
yeah, pretty much. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Like that, I really feel like is the unique thing that I and we are trying to do, because there's so many people that are like want to jump straight into politics. They want to be like, let's change things on a huge national, global, political scale, but they're not asking questions about what can I do? How can I reshift my
Mhm.
life? How can I encourage my friends, family, community, partner to align with this? And so I just really think that's the fertile ground that we're operating in, is that it starts here. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're not going to get those billion-dollar handouts that the politicians want to give to their friends. So we're going to have to start small with our own families, our own communities.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it too. I love all of the analogies to nature, and it is very much a grassroots movement. You have to plant seeds and you have to cultivate them, and then
Yep.
just all the analogies of like a tree, for example, and what that entails. Um, but yeah, man, and that then that ties into to what that to our ancestry and to like our pagan roots too, about where those values were, and where we lived close to the land and we worshiped the land and we valued the land, and then we all got away from that with Christianity and all kinds of other problems. That's another conversation, but I think a lot of it is also too, we're just trying to read us, like, this isn't something new. This is just really a lot of it's just returning to our roots, literally. So
Yeah.
yeah, very good.
Well, and as much as I'm, pro-pagan and critical of Christianity, the modern day, atheism and Marxism are moving us even further away from that. And now, it's almost like Christianity is a bulwark. Not that it's as good as, old style paganism used to be, but the Amish are living off the land a heck of a lot better
Yeah.
than the Marxists ever did.
Right. Yeah, it's things are like topsy turvy, like we've talked about before, and so I'm actually
Yeah.
I'm supposed to have a conversation this afternoon about Christianity, and we'll continue to. I know some of our next conversations will probably dive into like paganism and some other subjects, so we're gonna keep the ball
Oh yeah,
rolling
because
there.
the next one I think is going to be about like esotericism and occultism, right?
I believe so. Yeah, so that'll be a good one that'll kind of
Yeah.
tie into both.
Oh yeah, that'll get interesting.
Cool. Well, already, did you
All right.
was that kind of wrapping up? Did you have anything
Yeah,
else?
that's pretty much everything I wanted to go over today. Yeah, we'll try and put links in the description. There will be a link to that UNS article that I wrote that, goes into some of these things in a little bit more detail. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I think we had a really good discussion today, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Yeah, same. I'll definitely. I know we had our stream, and I don't know if Odyssey retains that, but I will probably be re-uploading this to YouTube and Odyssey, and we'll keep the ball rolling. So I appreciate it. It was a good chat. I will probably go ahead and cut it off there. If you had any other final notes.
No, that's it.
Alrighty, cool deal.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Yep.